And go.
Hi, I'm Jessie Gutsu. I'm a registered dietitian, and today I'm going to talk to you about food preservation. So we'll give everybody a second to log in. All right, let's get a roll on. So there are a lot of different types of food preservation, and because we only have about 20 minutes or so, I'll do a brief overview of the many different kinds. And we'll start with canning and move through most of these. We won't touch on all of them. So food by nature begins to spoil the moment that it is harvested or pulled off the vine. And early methods of food preservation allowed ancient man to be able to settle roots and create communities. Otherwise, they had to continue to move to find food in the next season. So preservation is a way that food is stopped in the aging process, and things like mold, yeast, and bacteria are inhibited, and so we can safely consume food that has come off the vine maybe months or even up to a year or so after it's been harvested. So canning is actually one of the newest types of food preservations, and there are different types of canning. There's water bath canning, which is typically used for higher acidic foods or those that are lower in pH, and that's because the water temperature doesn't have to get quite as high. So the safety of a more acidic food can be achieved with water bath canning, whereas those that are lower acidic foods require pressure cooking. And so pressure cooking is different than your home electric pressure canner like your Instapot. Those actually are not USDA approved for pressure canning. So it is a different piece of equipment. So canning can be either water bath or pressure canned, and then it can either use food that is raw or hot packed, and it is just as it sounds. Raw food is that it's raw and packed, and hot packed is food that's been cooked or partially cooked or parboiled and then packed. And actually the latter is more efficient for space. You can get a little bit more food in the jar with a hot packed method. So necessary equipment is, depending on the way you use, if you go pressure cooker method or a water bath, you need just a very large pot like you'd use to cook spaghetti. And then jars and lids are necessary. And then beyond that, the following couple of things are really nice to have. They make the process more efficient and definitely a little bit safer because you're dealing with really hot cans and a lot of hot water. So the lid wand is simply just a long wand with a magnet on the end, and it's used to pull out the lids and the rings from boiling water when you've sanitized them and warm them up before you're placing the food in the jar. And then a canning funnel is really nice to have, and it's shown in this image here. Because it keeps the rim of the jar nice and clean. If you have food particles and you haven't cleaned that rim, it can have, if you have food particles remnants there, it can lead to bacterial growth, and you don't want that because you could get sick from that. So, and then the jar lifter is also shown in the image, and that's really handy to have. If you don't have it, you can otherwise use like a pair of tongs and pull it out, but when you have something that's specifically made to lift a hot jar out, it makes you feel a lot more confident when you're pulling it out of the hot water bath. And then common foods are fruits, jams, jellies, salsas, meats, anything you can think of can be jarred. So the benefits of canning, and like all preservation methods, is that you can extend the shelf life of the food. And for most people, you have unlimited shelf space. So it can be stored in an extra pantry or in the basement or wherever you have additional space for food. The considerations with canning is it definitely requires more precision in time and temperature for safety. The biggest concern with canning is if done improperly, it can lead to risk of botulism, which is a foodborne illness that can cause a pretty big concern of illness. So you want to adjust your temperature of your water depending on the altitude that you live. So if you're in a higher altitude climate, then you want to raise your boiling point. And then this will require a little bit larger equipment. So a big pot or a pressure cooker is a fairly large piece of equipment, and then the additional pieces that are nice to have can be fairly large in take up some storage. And then you want to make sure that you're repurchasing the lids. So not the rings, but the lids need to be repurchased every time you use them. And you want to purchase them about a year at a time. If you do too far in advance, that silicone mesh, that silicone compound can degrade and lose its efficacy. So you have a greater risk of foodborne illness. So moving on to freezing. Freezing is a fairly simple process. You just want to cut your foods, prepare them in whatever desired manner that you wish to consume them in. So for example, if we'll take corn, if you want to slice it off the cob, and I recommend laying it on a tray and do the tray pack method. So you'd lay your food in a single layer and freeze it sort of individually, so it's not big one clump when you place it into your freezer bag. And this way is best for really high water content foods, which is often what you're going to be freezing anyway. So you want to make sure you lay them out and freeze them sort of individually and then pack them so they're not one big clump. You can use freezer bags for this. You can also use a vacuum seal bag and then just a cookie sheet and whatever necessary equipment to prep your food. The other thing, if you don't want to use a food saver vacuum sealer, is if you use a freezer bag, you can zip it up most of the way and then stick a straw in the end of it and suck out the additional air and then zip up that last half an inch or whatever is remaining. And that's a great way to save on equipment and then pull out the oxygen too, that will eventually sort of lead to degradation of the food quality. This is a really great method for soups and stews and things that are more liquid. But if you're doing that, you want to make sure you fill a bag and then lay it on its side so that it's more efficient in freezer space, but then you're going to freeze your food quick enough so that it's not in that danger zone for too long. So you're freezing it, you're slowing the food degradation and taking up less space in the freezer. So I find this the quickest method and a fairly low risk method. But the considerations are if you don't have an additional freezer space, or even if you do, it takes up a fair amount of space. So you're limited in the amount of food that you can freeze. And then it's not always the appropriate method for all foods. So foods that are higher in, if you have like bready foods or those that are really high in water content, like lettuce or pastas and things, won't freeze well, and you'll end up with like a limp food at the end. So you just want to make sure you pick a recipe that is designed for whatever food that you're choosing to follow this method, and make sure that not only it's food safe, but the quality and the outcome you'll be happy with as well. So moving on to jams and jellies, and these can be done either the canning method or the freezing method, but really I want to touch on this one because it's such a common thing that we use our fruits and nuts are often jams and jellies, but there are a lot of different types of jams, jellies, and other things, so I just want to touch on them because I think it's sort of confusing. So fruit products that are gelled are what would ultimately be a jam or a jelly, and some fruits have a high enough pectin content, like an apple, where pectin isn't necessarily added, but oftentimes you'll add pectin, sugar, and then an acid. So usually a lemon juice will be added for all for food safety and also for the quality and the outcome in the desired texture. So to touch on, you can see the image here. The jelly is like a fruit syrup or a fruit juice that's thickened. So it's smooth in consistency and it's more just like a jello type of substance. Whereas jams are cooked pieces of fruit, maybe in ununiform pieces, but they're chunkier. And preserves are either whole pieces of fruit or slightly larger uniform pieces, so similar to jams, but maybe less thicker consistency. And conserves are that same thing, like a preserve with added fruits and nuts, dried fruits and nuts. And marmalades are a mix of jams and jellies. So picture like chopped up pieces of fruit suspended in jelly, so suspended in like a fruit juice. So I think that's a fun thing to know because there are lots of different ways to do this. And then depending on the route you choose, whether you're freezing or canning your jam or jelly, you'd need those necessary equipment. And drying. So drying removes all the water, which eliminates the risk of yeast, mold, and bacterial growth. But it does not necessarily eliminate the activity of food enzymes. And so that means you can have a degradation in color, oftentimes with food that's dried, but it can be one of the longer preservation methods. Some dried foods can last up to 25 years. So food is dried at about 140 degrees and all of the water is removed. And this is often done with fruits and meats, and you can consume those foods as is, whereas with vegetables, you may want to rehydrate them either with a bath of water or just adding them to a soup or a stew before you consume them. The necessary equipment, traditionally this was done in the sun, and now we have an electric food dehydrator where it has several trays and it keeps it to about 140 degrees and does a lot of food at once. And alternatively, if you don't have that piece of equipment, you can use your traditional oven, a convection oven, to achieve the same thing. And then you just pack the food into storage bags, into freezer bags or vacuum sealed bags. If you're doing herbs, you can also just pack them into old spice containers as well. And often foods like fruit leathers, you think of like fruit roll-ups that you had as a kid. These are really good this way. Meat jerkies, herbs, and nuts and seeds are often dried. So the advantages, just like all food preservation methods, it extends the shelf life. And if you are storing them on shelf somewhere, you have unlimited shelf space. The considerations is that electric dehydrators have sort of limited capacity. So you'll be doing multiple rounds of this type of food because you don't want to overpack. If you don't have an electric dehydrator, and you're using your oven, a couple things to think about is keeping the temperature at 140. You don't want to go over because you can definitely scorch your food. Either it turns black or you just get an off flavor. It just sort of reduces the flavor of the food if you go to too high of heat. And the other thing is you want to make sure you keep the oven door ajar about 3-4 inches, and that lets the moisture escape from the food. Otherwise, you'll end up with a really rubbery texture food. So it's not the most energy efficient way, but it does get the job done. So moving on to pickling. Pickling is a preservation process that you add an acid, typically of vinegar, with a mixture of water and salt, maybe herbs and spices. And so you create this brine and you prep your vegetables or whatever food you're going to pickle, and you pour the brine over and then you process it like the canning method. So you'd follow it from there. Needing the equipment to can is also necessary. Typical foods to pickle are your acidic foods, vegetables, and meats and eggs. This is not the same process as fermenting. So the advantages of pickling is that you have unlimited shelf space again, and you extend the shelf life of the food, but the disadvantage is that you kill beneficial bacteria along the process. So even though vinegar is added, it is not necessarily by default a fermented product if you are pickling. And we'll move on to the fermentation process now. So fermenting is essentially controlled decay of food. It's a newer-ish form of preservation in terms that there aren't a lot of governmental guidelines for fermenting. It's a preservation process that results in the chemical reaction between bacteria and yeast that are naturally present in food and the sugars found in that food. So the bacteria or yeast eat these sugars and consume them, and their byproduct creates this acidic environment that inhibits the growth of dangerous bacteria, yeast, and mold, and keeps the good bacteria that are actually really good for our microbiome. You will follow the same process, needing jars and lids or some type of glass container like you would for canning. And similar to pickling, you'd prep your food and create a solution and completely submerge your food in the solution. So you really want to make sure with this method that all of the ingredients are submerged in whatever brine you have. You can use something called pickle pebbles, ramekins, weights, bags filled with water, anything that keeps the food completely submerged in your brine. And essentially, this is fairly hands-off process after you start after you do the hands-on piece that doesn't take a ton of time, but the hands-off process can be a week up to 3-4 weeks. And you just leave it in ambient temperature, and occasionally you're burping this product and allowing the gases to be released so you don't have some big explosion. And then you can taste it along the way, and once it gets to the desired taste that you're looking for, it's ready to be either sealed up and placed on your shelf or consumed. Typical foods can be fruits and vegetables. People often will do grains, tea like kombucha, and dairy like a kefir. And some people even ferment meats. So it depends on your comfort level with this. These are shelf-stable foods. If you are purchasing this food, though, often you will find it in the store shelves. So something that I wanted to point out the difference between fermenting and pickling is if you're looking for a fermented product with live and active probiotics or live and active bacteria, it will say it on the food label. So it'll explicitly say live and active cultures. And that means that there are active bacteria. Whereas if you're getting a pickled product, this is packed aseptically, and so there's heat applied to this product, which kills off the bacteria, and you'll typically find these on store shelves versus in the refrigerator. So it's a good differentiation between the two. With fermenting, the outcome is more of like a sour, complex flavor, whereas pickling, you sort of get just one flavor and it stops there. Fermenting, depending on what you're using and the duration that you fermented the food, it can really change the taste of the food and the final product. So again, advantages are you have unlimited shelf space. For some products, they do go directly into the refrigerator. So it depends on what you're making. And the considerations is it's a fairly hands-off product process, but there aren't a ton of USDA guidelines. So there aren't a ton of science-backed recipes that will tell you whether you're doing this right or wrong. When you're looking at a product, though, you can pretty much trust your gut whether you've done it right. You can see mold with your naked eye. You can usually taste or smell when something's off, and then you just dump it and restart. So that covers most of the topics. So when you're getting started, you want to select a quality tested recipe and read through all of your recipe instructions as well as your equipment instructions before you get started. Some of these processes are really time sensitive, so you want to make sure that you know what you're doing before you get rolling. And then make sure that you're selecting quality ingredients. The preservation process is not going to bring food back to life. You want to make sure that you're choosing ingredients that aren't overly ripe, that aren't bruised, that are of good quality, that you'd want to eat at the time that you'd pick them and do the process, as well as maybe months or years to come. So here are some resources. MSU Extension has a lot of good ones. Your ball jar book is a great resource as well, but make sure you're getting a sound recipe that's been backed and tested so that you know that your final product is not only tasty, but also is food safe. So again, I'm Jessie, and if you want to find me on Instagram, my handle is Cultivate Nutrition 365, and I also have a website at cultivatenutritionrdn.com. Thank you.